common topic of discussion among drummers is how best to grip the sticks and the best technique to use. Of course, the only correct response to all of these is that the best technique is whichever allows you to play the music you want to play as comfortably as it is possible for you to do so. For many people, this means picking an approach and learning how to do everything with that consistent approach. For right-handed players, this is commonly right-hand lead, so your hands cross when you're playing the hi-hat and snare. And this is accompanied by matched grip, so you hold both sticks just like you've picked them up off the table. The advantage of doing things this way is the removal of any ambiguity. You train your brain to internalize one way to play a particular phrasing, and so you're less likely to get muddled on the kit. However, unless you are truly 100% ambidextrous, you will always have one side that is a bit more capable of fine motor movements than the other. Because of this, I find that, at least for me, a more effective strategy is to change my grip or approach to suit what I'm playing. That way, I'm able to shift the burden of the most complicated parts to my more developed or dexterous muscle groups, and the simpler parts to the less developed ones, i.e. my weaker side, or my weaker hand. At the moment, you can see me playing open-handed, which is the left hand on the hi-hat, and I'm also playing matched grip. This is my default method of playing, and is the way that I taught myself to play, since it's the way that I find the most comfortable and the most natural for most music. I'll briefly point out that my kit is set up in the regular right-handed style, except for the fact that I have more cymbal action going on the left. So my ride is directly above the snare rather than on the right side of the kit where it would usually be on a right-handed setup, so that I can play with either hand, i.e. right hand on the hi-hat or left hand on the hi-hat, without crossing them. And I also have a trash cymbal or a China cymbal set up on my far left, where it would normally be on the far right for a right-handed drummer. Although cymbal placement does vary from drummer to drummer. In an ideal world, I'd have a completely symmetric setup, but we all have space and money limitations, so sometimes you just have to make do. Coming back to the hands, there are two elements to playing this way. That is left hand lead, matched grip. The first element is using the left hand on the cymbals to outline the main feel of time, which is typically the role that the hi-hat or ride cymbal tends to play in a song. I myself am right-handed, and so my left hand is weaker. A lot of people used to think that I was ambidextrous or left-handed because I played left-handed lead. I'm not, I'm very right-handed. However, what it can do well, that is what my left hand can do well, is play simple and constant patterns. It's kind of my autopilot hand. This works quite well for outlining quarter or eighth note feels in drum grooves, which is essentially the norm in most pop, rock and metal style music. And that's what you can kind of hear me playing in the background at the moment. The second element is the open-handed approach. Because my hands are not crossing at the moment, I am free to explore the bulk of the kit with my right hand. And since my right hand is stronger, I can add in interesting elements to grooves. It makes fills easier since your right hand is always on or near the snare, but it's capable of moving around freely over the toms and the other side of the kit. The left hand, being the autopilot hand as I've called it, also means that you can kind of keep it going as a constant pulse while you play more complicated polyrhythms around it. So, for example, additional ghost notes with the right hand, or some more complicated snare patterns. Also, you can keep the left hand going and do one-handed fills, double strokes with your right hand, or add an accent with a crash cymbal whilst the left hand is still going and playing those eighth notes or quarter notes or what have you. What I find, and what you may find as well, is that when you're playing the drums, most of your limb movements are automatic, at least once you get past being a complete beginner. You can only really focus your attention on one thing at a time, so this level of unconscious processing is necessary on any instrument. When I'm playing left-hand lead with simple cymbal patterns, I'm using relatively little mental bandwidth. This allows me to focus on more interesting things with other limbs. However, there is, for me at least, something of a crossing point after which I have to focus all of my mental bandwidth on my left hand in order to keep it in check. This usually happens either when the tempo gets too quick and I'm playing a lot of notes. This is common with 16th note type patterns. Or when I have to play something that requires a bit of syncopation, where the pattern or rhythm is a little bit more complicated than just keeping a constant pulse or a repetitive pattern. A lot of the time I do still choose to play this with left hand lead for various reasons. Again, mostly because I can then use my right hand for more complicated things as well. But even though I do play sometimes with my left hand for these more complicated grooves, it's often more comfortable to me and it starts to sound a little bit smoother if I switch it to right hand lead. And as I said, especially with 16th note patterns, these can sound a little bit strained and become a little bit difficult, especially at faster tempos, to maintain with open-handed or left-hand lead technique. Turning up the complexity of the cymbal work further, I pretty much exclusively start to use the right-hand lead when it comes to grooves like the shuffle groove or swing jazz type grooves. One thing I'll point out with my setup, which is kind of an advantage of having an electronic drum kit, is that I've set the rim of my second tom to be a hi-hat as well. This allows me to sometimes play fast 16th note two-handed patterns, or right-hand lead for a short time within a song, whilst maintaining my open-handed posture. Although it's my least used playing style, I will use right hand lead with traditional grip when playing swing jazz or complex shuffle grooves with a lot of ghost notes or other snare work. Ergonomically, I don't think you can argue that traditional grip makes more sense than match grip, unless you're Buddy Rich, but then he thought that anything he did was the best technique. The reason I don't use it much is because it feels quite restrictive in terms of movement around the kit. However, the traditional grip kind of has one major advantage for your weaker hand. When you play matched grip, you're mainly using an up and down wrist movement to make the final motion that hits the drum. With traditional grip, you're mainly using the rotation of your forearm to make the final motion that hits the drum. Because rotating your forearm is kind of a larger muscle group, the weaker hand has an easier time of it because it uses a lot less effort to make that final motion. You can grip the stick quite loosely and use a lot of rebound to make the stick and the head do most of the work. This means that for the same amount of effort, you can play more notes. Additionally, the rotational motion seems to make it easier to play at a lower volume, which helps with playing more dynamic or subtle phrases on the snare. Of course, jazz tends to be full of this stuff, which is often, I think, why you see many jazz drummers stick to traditional grip on the snare. Personally, I find that I can do drum rolls, one-handed roll type things, ghost notes far more easily using traditional grip, just because it uses a lot less effort to do them. And that means that when I want to focus on so-called snare drum playing rather than drum kit playing, if that makes any sense, I'll revert to traditional grip. And it's quite handy for jazz solos and sort of swing jazz where you're really just using the snare drum as kind of like an accent tool, and you're doing things very subtly. So to sum up, I stress again that playing the way that you feel most comfortable and the way that allows you to play at the best of your abilities is by far the most important thing to do on the drums, and I don't want to encourage or discourage you to do anything differently if you're happy with what you're doing. However, I hope that by sharing how I personally vary my approach on the drum kit, it might help you to understand some of the relative merits of different hand techniques that you can use on a drum kit. This final song that I'm playing is a rough approximation of The One Step by Chick Corea, and it sort of leverages a bunch of different techniques that I find help me to play different parts of the song which require sort of slightly different techniques and demand that different parts of your body take the burden of playing the most complicated parts at any one given time. And with that, that's all I have to say. So happy experimenting, and I hope you find something useful in this video.